Okay.
Great. DJ Chuang here on the Social Media Church podcast, and today I'm happy to be connecting with my old friend, my old online friend, Justin Wise, who's based in Des Moines, Iowa. Not exactly a high-tech place when you think of high-tech places, but there's quite a bit of high-tech activity there.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to kind of go back and let you hear his backstory, because he was such an early adopter and champion and advocate for social media when he was part of a Lutheran church, I believe, there in Des Moines. So if you would tell us the backstory and how you try to incorporate social media into a kind of a traditional church context, but with emerging worship services.
Sure. Yeah, well, first and foremost, DJ, thank you for having me here. You're bringing in some heavy hitters, and so I'm honored to be amongst them. But to give you in the audience a bit of a background, I graduated college in 2003 and kind of stumbled my way through some different careers, and had kind of a faith transformation experience my senior year of college. And so again, graduated and really wasn't quite sure what I would be doing. Of course, this is back in 2003 before social media was even really a thing. So again, went through some kind of random jobs and then eventually ended up interning at Lutheran Church of Hope here in Des Moines. Now, Hope at the time was much smaller than it is now, but it was still fairly big, especially in terms of Lutheran churches. And so, got involved in volunteering there, and through a couple series of events, ended up coming on staff, and then made the decision to go into seminary, and did so at St. Paul-based Bethel Seminary. And the degree that I got was the Master of Divinity program, but more importantly, I started the program online. And that's really, for me, what started to unlock I guess you could say, the power and the connecting potential behind ministry in an online context. And so started going through the program, and, by that time, social media had started kind of making started building momentum. And so got involved with Twitter and got involved with Facebook, and then through a distributed learning program, begin to think, how can we apply what we're doing through Bethel, online dialogues, video lectures, some live video lectures. How can we begin to apply this to what we're doing at Hope? And this really formed a foundation for me to start thinking through things like an online campus, or, integrating social media into our communications platform as a church. And so through the rest of my time at Hope, that's really what I spent my time doing, is figuring out, how do we do ministry online? How do we become a community online, a community that's focus is, building God's kingdom? How do we do that in an online context? So that's kind of where my background in terms of where I come from, and really what's driving my passion for social media and the church, is because I've seen the potential of what happens when people connect to ideas in an online context. And of course, I think everyone here would acknowledge and recognize that the gospel as an idea is tremendously powerful and translates well over pretty much any culture, including the online culture. And so really that's where the seedbed, I guess, of my driving passion for seeing the church connecting with the power of social media really comes from.
Yeah, and really when you think about the Word of God, it came to us through paper, which is a technology, over 2,000 years. And you yourself, having been trained and educated in an online context, recognize the power of media over time and over distance, both. And so I think you're the first Lutheran on our social media church podcast. So I know Lutheran ecclesiology is unique. So perhaps incorporating social media into that community had its own unique issues and challenges. So what were you able to roll out in that context to support community building?
Well, it's interesting because, when you look at the history of the Lutheran Church, right, you have to trace it back to Martin Luther. And Luther was a guy who, not to bore people with Lutheran history, but he was a guy who embraced the technology of his day, that being the printing press. It was invented right around the time that Luther was kind of going through his formative years and, really having his theology shaped and molded. And he looked at the printing press and said, what would happen? What could happen if we translated the Bible, because the Bible at that time was only available to the clergy, right? They were the only ones who could actually read it because, of course, the Bible was written in Latin. But Luther said, what if we translated the Bible into a language that everyone could understand? And then he went about, translating it into common German, which the average person could understand. And then he said, what if we sent this Bible through the printing press and got it into the hands of as many people as possible? The idea was scandalous. And Luther got in a lot of trouble for doing that. But he was a guy who embraced technology and said, what could happen with God's kingdom if we did this? And so really, my efforts in the Lutheran Church have all tied back to that inciting incident with Luther. Because, if it's one thing that I know about Lutheran churches, it's that we love coffee, we love potlucks, and we love Martin Luther. So if you can say, listen, this is a common starting ground for us. We all, agree that Luther had a lot of good things going for him. Of course, he also had some not so good things going for him, which just read some of the later writings of Luther and you'll see exactly what I mean. But he had a lot of good things going for him. So look at what he did. And really all social media is, or digital technology, digital communication, is just updating the technology of the day. And so through that conversation, I was able to gain a lot of traction, especially in the context that I was in at Hope. And, at Hope, when I first introduced the idea of, hey, what if we went online and really embraced social media as a church, it was met with a lot of pushback. I mean, a lot of pushback, primarily because, back then, social media was very much a mystery, and the objections really formulated around, I think, what's the word? I think there were reasonable objections in so much as they were saying, we don't know what we're opening ourselves up to. What if people criticize us? What if we, who's going to essentially police or, watch over this discussion? All great questions to be asked. But I remember, and I can tell this story now because I'm not on staff anymore.
Well, thanks for sharing it here.
I can tell this story now, but when I was on staff, Pastor Mike, who's the senior pastor at Hope, he was very much opposed to social media. And so not against his wishes, but I would say unbeknownst to his wishes, I started a fan page for the church. And before I knew it, we had 1,500 fans on the page.
Wow.
Yeah, and now at the time the church was around 6,000 or 7,000. Now it's over 10,000. But this thing exploded. This was, I would say, probably 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. More like 2010. Either way, it just took off. And I knew before long that I was going to have to tell Pastor Mike, or he was going to find out. He wasn't on Facebook, but I knew it was a matter of time where he would find out. So I talked to him about it. I said, hey, Pastor Mike, I went ahead and did this, but I really think you should take a look at what's going on there. This is some really cool stuff. And instead of, being angry or mad, he looked at it and he said something I'll never forget. He said, Justin, there is ministry happening on this fan page. Because exactly. I would post things like Bible verse or a question of the day, or, encourage the people who were on the fan page. And he began to see this happening where, not only me as a staff person was leading this discussion, but also community members of the church were interacting with one another and taking care of one another and encouraging one another. And he saw this, and to his credit, he said, this is ministry. Ministry is happening online. Before long, he was on Facebook himself and really began to see it as not a nuisance or a liability or a danger or even a diversion, but a real asset to the church community as a whole. So that's kind of, the path that I took, and really a case study, I guess you could say, for a church that traditionally, of course, being Lutheran in denomination, that typically isn't known for innovation.
What a fantastic story. That's great to hear how a traditionally minded church could see and recognize it and embrace ministry as it happens. So thank you for sharing that. What else did you try that was more official?
The first things, well, one of the biggest projects, I guess I should say, was building our online campus. And online campuses, again, this was back around 2010, 2011. This wasn't a brand new idea. Of course, people had been doing this for years at that point. Lifechurch.tv, Vince Murat down in Austin, Texas had been doing it for a while at that time. These were all guys that I, looked to and said, hey, can you help me out? And there of course are dozens of others. As if you go through the list of podcasts of people you've talked to so far, that can attest to it. But for us, this was a new initiative, and it was especially new for a Lutheran church to be doing something like that. And so we went about the process of building our online campus. And it stands to this day. If you go to hopeonline.tv, that was kind of the big project that I helped launch. Not much has been done with it since I left, but it's something that gets thousands and thousands of viewers every week, and so the vision has stayed, and the word continues to be preached online, and lives are being changed, and it's a great thing to be able to say I helped contribute to that project, and of course I had an amazing team helping to build that, but to be able to step back and say, in some way, the gospel is going forth. And yes, it looks different than what we all know church to be. The church, of course, being the sent out ones, right? The gathering of people. It looks different than it has looked in, the centuries prior. But I can attest to, and there's countless stories of people that we have talked to who have said, my life is different. God touched my life, touched my heart, changed the way that I think because of this online campus. Those are results that cannot be ignored. Those are results that cannot be argued away. They can't be, when you see at the base of it the fruit of the Spirit, that is the very definition of the gospel being preached and sent out. So for me, I'm a huge believer in that. That was really my last kind of official project with Hope before leaving and transitioning to staff with Monk. But it's probably the biggest project and the most in terms of time, but also in terms of results as well.
Well, that's great. Maybe we need a new metaphor. Rather than being gathered and sent, it's a people who are connected to the body and the word, and as we're going, we're living the gospel.
Yeah, and I think there is something to that word connection, because Alan Hirsch says it best. It's one of my favorite quotes ever. He says, the gospel is transmitted along relational lines. And, I know that's not, John chapter, 18 or whatever. It's a guy who thinks about church stuff, but he's on to something there. And really, when you look at the life of Jesus, you see someone who connects with people in meaningful ways, and their lives are changed forever because of it. And so I think as the church, we have every responsibility to see how we can connect with as many people as possible and allow those relational lines to transmit, the saving work of Jesus. And sure, there are going to be discussions around best practices, but I think ultimately results have to speak for themselves. And I know I can attest to it. Dozens of others who have led online movements like that can attest to it. When people connect to the Word of God, whether it's in person or online, lives are changed. So yeah, I totally agree with you in terms of centering on connection. Because the methods are always going to change, right? The methods will change. In 100 years from now, we'll be having a completely different discussion. But what doesn't change is that the gospel does transmit along relational lines.
Yeah, those are powerful stories. And let's fast forward now. You are working with a fast-growing company in San Diego while you live in Des Moines. And so I wanted to hear how you work as one company in multiple locations. And you're a technology company, so you still have a very active role in social media. So what is it that you and Monk Development do to serve the church and deliver value?
So our biggest hope and desire is that churches would be able to tell their story effectively online. And I know that word story is a buzzword, but really when you get down to it, every church has their own unique identity and their own unique story. Yes, collectively as the capital C church, we are all telling the same story, right? The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But I believe, and I think, at Monk, we would say that each church has a unique calling, a unique identity. And so what we really try and do is help churches identify what that story is and then help them translate that online. And a lot of the churches that we work with, they have an amazing story. They have, a tremendous history and a rich, a testimony. So they can point to the ways, road markers along the way of where God has, spoken to them as a collective community. But oftentimes what happens is that story gets short-circuited when it goes online. And practically speaking, that means the website is horribly out of date. Or, there's pictures of stock photography, right? So there's these group photos that are always, impeccably balanced in terms of, racial and ethnic lines. But when people show up in person, their church looks nothing like that. And so what we really try and do is say, listen, we want to help you translate your mission as a church into an online setting. And that has application for, of course, obviously their website, their social media presence, their email newsletters. I mean, any type of communication that touches the online atmosphere really is part of telling the church's story. And businesses would call it marketing. For some reason, that word is a bad, it's a bad word in the church circles. But really, that's what it is helping a church tell their story effectively online. So it's a lot of fun. We have a little team here in Des Moines that primarily focuses on marketing. And then the rest of the team is in HQ in San Diego. And then we have some dispersed team members across the country as well. But, it's not without its challenges. I mean, anyone who works in a distributed atmosphere can tell you that, it's not perfect. There are times where you just rather sit down across the table from someone. But, there are ways to bridge that relational gap in a way that, it may not be the best thing, but it's the next best thing. And you can really make some cool things happen in those settings.
Give us one tip of what you guys do to stay connected.
So for us, actually, what I was doing right before our meeting here today, we have daily meetups. And it's myself, my team member Jody, who's here in Des Moines, and then a whole slew of folks in the San Diego office. And we do those daily. It's a go-to meeting. Or we used to do Google Plus, but we found that it was just a little bit too choppy. So we moved to GoToMeeting. The connection is a little more stable. And so for us, it's just a real easy way, 15, 20 minutes tops, to say what's going on in your world. How can we help? We can see each other's faces. We can see their computer screen if we need to. So it's a good way for us just to stay connected and realize that, okay, there are human beings on the other side of these computer screens.
That's great. And you're working on a book project, so give us a hint of what's going on.
Yeah, so the book is it's through Moody, and the subtitle is a Theology of Digital Communication. And I share the subtitle because we're still trying to figure out what the actual title will be.
Okay, well, we'll put a poll up and have our listeners vote on one. How about that?
Yes, do that. I love it. Crowdsource the title for all I care.
Give us a synopsis and we'll do it. Seriously.
The book is going to primarily be taking a look at how social technology, digital communication, and I'm using those terms synonymously here, but taking a look at how it has altered the fabric of the local church, and then seeing the implications that it will have for the future church. So, for example, one of the examples that I use in the book is basically, taking a look at what John Acuff did through Stuff Christians Like, where he leveraged his blog audience to build not one, but 2 orphanages in Vietnam. My guess is that he knew a small percentage of the people who contributed to those projects, but the vast majority of those folks he will never see or meet or, touch base with in person, but yet he was able to leverage his online community to really impact the lives of real flesh and blood people halfway across the world. Now, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, that never would have been as possible to happen as quickly as it did, as efficiently as it did, and to help people that he probably never will even meet. So that's one example of saying, as the church, how do we use these social technology tools to further the mission of building God's kingdom? What are some pitfalls that we need to look out for? And what does the future look like for the social church? Because I believe that it has implications for everything from how churches are led, meaning the hierarchical structure that you see in a lot of mega churches. That's going to change. That's going to shift because of the two-way nature of social media, right? We as a culture have gained a taste for having our voices heard. And so as future generations take leadership positions, they're not just going to write that off and say, wow, that was really nice to actually be heard. No, that's going to be an embedded value that they have. And so the church moving forward will have a very different feel and look than I think it does now. And so trying to prognosticate and see and really take some of the events of the last few years and chart a course for the future that leaders can look at and say, instead of being reactive 10 years down the road, how do we be proactive right now so we're not so far down behind the 8 ball that, the gap between where we are to where we want to be is just too big.
Wow, I like what you're thinking and writing. I mean, this sounds provocative and really can open some doors and help us launch into the 21st century while we're in the 21st century.
Hope. Honestly and truly, the book wins. At the end of the day, this book will win if it can open discussion primarily between established generations and emerging generations. Because, and I know this through our work at Monk, that's where we're seeing a tension point now And this happens anytime leadership transitions, right? There's just an inherent inbuilt tension between the outgoing generation and the incoming generation. But this generation, this generational this generational transition, I guess you could say, the tension is exasperated because on top of that transition, you also have a communications transition in moving from broadcast to digital. So it's like this perfect storm. And so this era that we're in right now is so unique because leaders, both young and old, are really having to answer some really difficult questions.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. This is great. Thank you so much, Justin. Great chatting with you here at Social Media Church. Now, for some reason, when I talk and you talk, it runs over each other.
I totally walk over your outro.
No, I'll have a separate outro, but usually I just say thank you and goodbye. But it's strange. I've started noticing it with call recorders. Somehow it's not managing both tracks very well. Or maybe it is. I just can't hear it. So maybe on the recording it's fine. Man, I should get Monk to be a sponsor on this thing.
Crazier things have happened, man.
Do they sponsor things?
We used to do a lot more of that, but we're sinking a lot of our ad budget in conferences.
Those are expensive.
I know. Well,
those are so expensive.
That's why we're only doing like 3 conferences this year, but the ones that we are doing, we're pretty much pouring every last marketing dollar in there.
Yeah. I spent a week, when I was at American Bible Society, I spent a week at the African Methodist Episcopal Convention.
Whoa.
In Indianapolis. It was a week long. They're campaigning on buses and billboards for their next elected bishops or whatever. And we just sat in the trade show booth for a week and spent a good 5 digits on little engagement. I mean, it's just like, I don't know how people do it. I don't know how people make the conference dollars work, because when I saw the bill and what they charge for stuff, I'm like, man, that doesn't make sense.
It's just like, hey, just give that money to me and I'll build a marketing plan for you. Right?
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. Anyways, hey, keep up the great work. I mean, I love what you're doing, and thanks for sharing a bit of what you're writing, because I think that's a powerful book. We don't need more how-to books. I mean, they're good, but we need some real thinking to really reshape the church and the world.
Trying to do it, man. Trying to do it.
Awesome.
Okay,
when do you come down to San Diego? I mean, I'm just an hour north.
We were just out there for a whole week, but I was toast.
Yeah.
Toast because we had our entire team virtual and on.
How big is your team now at Monk?
I want to say 26.
Goodness.
9 of them are remote.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Great job. You've got some learnings there that could be helpful to other companies too, because we need to learn how to co-work in the new age too. Well,
I think I read something the other day, like by 2020, 45%. Oh, that's who it was. Ben Arment was telling me this. By 2020, like 45% of workers will be remote in some capacity.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's 7 years away.
I know. And by some capacity, I mean like, they work 1 day from home or something.
Yeah. Still. I mean, that's right. That's right next to 50%. Wow. Awesome.
The actual stat, but I think it was somewhere in between 40 and 50%.
Well, I'll quote you, quoting Ben Arment. So there you go. I heard it from Justin and Ben.
Love.
Awesome. I held you a few minutes over. Sorry. So enjoy your lunch.
Thanks so much. So good talking to you, man. And let's keep in touch.